Let's say a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. It's a loving Father. As we gather today, we simply want to somehow know more about the history of our church, how it came to be, and the blessings and the call of your Spirit. You know, one of the things that Father Greg has always said is the Spirit is constantly calling together the church. The Spirit has always been there, guiding the church. You know, special opportunities. So help us to just cherish our history, to love it, because knowledge can really be power. So we praise you and we thank you always in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Today, what I want to start with is, it's either 336 or 337, is the death of Constantine. After the death of Constantine, for all practical purposes, you end up with two empires. Okay, till the end, the Eastern Empire called themselves the Roman Empire. But for simply use, let us say the Eastern Empire we call the Byzantine Empire. You know, just simply to avoid any doubts and any contradictions. So after the death of Constantine, you have what we'll call the Roman Empire in the West and the Byzantine Empire in the East. Now, the Byzantine Empire is well organized, it's wealthy, it's dynamic. The Byzantine Empire for the next 300 years rules the area of what we call Anatolia. Anatolia would be present-day Turkey, Asian Turkey. That's called the Anatolian Plain or Anatolia. They run that, Greece, parts of modern-day Yugoslavia, parts of Bulgaria. Then they go into parts of present-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. That's the Byzantine Empire at the death of Constantine. And it remains a very wealthy empire. There's a hiccup, and something we'll say more about it later, is suddenly the rise of the Arabs. The Arabs take over that portion of the empire, which would be Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt. Plus they move throughout all of North Africa. But it's a little hiccup, and for a while it hits the Byzantine Empire. But it recovers very quickly. And the Byzantine Empire is going to last, is a very strong empire for another 4 centuries, where it's going to really run into trouble with the Turks. Okay. Now, one of the things that's a big difference between the church headed by Rome and the churches headed by Constantinople is when Rome sends out missionaries, they all maintain contact with Rome. There's a sense of unity in Rome. So what we call the Latin Rite, that Roman Catholic tendency is, as they founded new places, they remain tied to Rome. The Eastern Church tends to set up what they call autocephalous, independent churches, where the metropolitan or patriarch is totally independent of the founding church. So the histories of the two churches really differ. So in the West, we have a church in which we have the headquarters in Rome, the Pope, and the bishops are appointed by him. When you get into the Eastern churches, they tend to be very independent. They select their own bishops, they elect their own bishops. They're under a metropolitan. So the history, even the history there is quite different. What I'm interested in this talk is the history of the Roman Catholic Church, which comes out of Rome. and the ups and downs of that period. That's what really is our history. The Eastern churches, with their alternate system of establishing and sending out missionaries, is quite different. But for the most part, most of us belong to a Roman Catholic tradition, and we're not affected by that. Okay. In the West, with the death of Constantine, Rome is in trouble. Let me give you an example. Basically from 337 to 476, 140 years, you have 29 emperors in the West. That should say a great deal. For some of them, their reign is about 9 or 10 months. The other salient fact that you should know is, of these 29 emperors, only 8 died a natural death. They were either assassinated, killed by someone, died in battle. Of 29, only 8 died a natural death. Now, a lot of the reasons is Rome has lost its dynamism. You know, Rome, which conquered the Mediterranean world, suddenly is living off the empire, and that's going to be a problem. The unemployment in Rome runs at about 55%. So what the emperors have to do is entertain the people and feed the people. So what you have is basically Rome has become a total welfare state. To keep the people at peace, you make sure they're fed and they're entertained. And that's the role of the gladiator games and other things. For instance, when you read Roman history, the races, the gladiator games, gladiators that fought to their death. In fact, there's a story of once one emperor flooded the Colosseum. Inside he built 2 ships. And for the entertainment of some 60,000 people, these ships engaged in a real fight. It wasn't a mock fight. They fought to the death. And the winning, is finally when the other ship was wiped out, they were the winners and they got the money. But this was what had happened to the Roman Empire. It was simply falling apart. And so finally in 476, the last Romulus Augustulus is put aside. Now, part of it is, of course, the barbarians are coming into Western Europe. The barbarians are literally being paid by the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, to go west. Byzantium basically feels it's cheaper to pay them off. It's a type of appeasement. They'll pay them off and tell them, go west. And it's much cheaper than fighting them. So the Byzantine Empire is very wealthy, but they're causing havoc in the West. And, you have the sack of Rome, you have the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Vandals. Western Europe is beginning to collapse. Now, one of the things that's going to happen is, as the bureaucracy of what had been in the Roman Empire, as they disappear, what happens in the West is the church is the only organization they can take over. The church is there. And so more and more what you're going to find out is, especially with the bishops and the higher clergy, they take over not only ecclesiastical duties, but political duties. They become basically the governors. They are the ones, if you want to have any stability after, let's say, 480, it's the church in the West. And so this forms a total difference of the church in the West. Later on, if you remember, there's a famous fight between Gregory VII and Emperor Henry, where the Pope, Gregory VII, is standing up to the emperor. That's Western European history. In the East, you very much find the strength is in the emperor, in the imperial thing, and the church is very much subservient. The emperor appoints the archbishop or the patriarch of Constantinople. So you have, even in the church, you have total different histories, mainly because of what is going on in this place. The attack of the barbarians just simply destroys the Roman Empire in the West. It can't recover. And Rome is a disaster. Now, one of the things that's going to happen is, and this is one of the difficulties as we go through history, is there are certain things that are contemporaneous that are going on, and we have to hit them. One of the things is in 476, you have the abdication of Romulus Augustus, considered to be the last emperor of the West. Okay. What's very interesting is, 4 years later, is born a very key player in European history, Benedict. Benedict, who is the founder of Western monasticism. He is the first one, and his rule is going to spread through well over 1,000 monasteries that will exist in Western Europe. He's a key figure. And if I could share with you is, when I was at UCLA studying history, this time period was taught by a man. I really liked him. He was a great teacher, but he was an agnostic. And he saw, for instance, this idea of Benedict being born 4 years after the last emperor as simply serendipity. He would say is the church was blessed that at key moments, people arose that were really going to be very key in history. And so he would talk about the serendipity of Benedict that would have a vision and be able to carry it out and to set up a whole history of monasteries. One of the things that we've got to do is, we're Christians, we're Catholics, and we come with a definite background. See, I see this as the Spirit alive in our world, as the blessings of the Spirit. It's not serendipity. It's that Spirit calling forth the church and always utter renewing it. And that has to be part of our faith, is, it's not just a coincidence. The last emperor was gone. The church needed something. The world, the Western world needed something. And the Spirit called into being Benedict. Benedict, who grew up in a fairly well-to-do family, but really turned off by the corruption of Roman society. I mean, the graft, the corruption. And so he first of all became a hermit, living alone. But then gradually people came to follow him. And so eventually he started the monasticism, the Benedictines. And the Benedictines have taken many different forms. You have the Benedictines, and then you have the Cistercians. Other communities have followed Benedict's rule, but he is a key player. Because what Benedict does is, in the instability of the Europe at this time, he moves his monasteries to the mountaintops, to the hilltops, where they can be protected. And so as the whole culture of the West falls apart, you have these monasteries. And these monasteries serve as places where works of art, knowledge can be kept. They set up libraries. They copied works. They copied the scriptures. Monks that literally at times could only copy. Many times they weren't literate, but they made copies of the Bible. They kept copies of works. And monasteries served not only as centers of learning, but they also served as hotels, hospitals, orphanages, schools. They became very key centers. And so many times families, for safety reasons, would send their children to study under the Benedictines, hoping, eventually they could return home educated and safe. So these monasteries were real light amidst what was happening in Western Europe. They were the light. And that is why, for instance, today, Benedict is considered one of the patrons of Europe. The church has elevated him as one of the special patrons of Europe for what he did in maintaining knowledge. Okay, that's one of the bright moments as Western Europe is falling with the confusion of the infighting among the infighting that's going on, the infighting between the different barbarian tribes. And a word about barbarian. Barbarian comes from the Greek. And basically, they considered anybody that was not Greek a barbarian. And the word came because what they thought their language always was bar. So they called them barbarians. And so it was very much of a Greek term. The Greeks, it was either you were Greek or you were barbarian. Just like with the Jews, you were Jew or Gentile. There was no in between. Okay, so the barbarians are conquering Europe. And some of them are setting up small little kingdoms. You do not have the great national states that we have today. I mean, France was divided into about 40 different jurisdictions. So was Germany. In fact, what you've got to realize is that for Germany and Italy, unification doesn't come till about basically 1870. What you had is a history of different city-states like Florence, Venice, Turin, Milan, fighting each other and being very, very independent. So Western Europe is not the national states that we're going to see emerge in the Middle Ages, in the Middle Ages. They're not there yet. Okay, now when all of this is going on, there's a bright light appearing. And I'm going to say this not because I'm half Irish, but one of the key things is up to from about 440 to 680, Ireland is a bright light in the Western world. Now, St. Patrick probably was English. He was caught and kidnapped and enslaved. He went to Ireland. He escaped, went to France, became a priest and a bishop, and went back to Ireland. I mean, that seems to be the most basic thing we know about him. And he Christianized basically Ireland, and started the process. Now, what's unique is for the Roman Church, this is the first time you have an apostle of Rome going to an area that never was part of the Roman Empire. It's rather unique. For the first time, a non-area of the Roman Empire was evangelized and converted. And Ireland really flourishes. Monasteries, the ability, the monks, what they do. In fact, there's a book out that's probably a little exaggeration is that fact that Ireland saved Western Europe because its missionaries. It's not just in our recent history that priests and religious have gone out from Ireland. After 500, Irish monks and priests go out, and they go to the mainland. For instance, Alcuin, who runs a school in Paris, a school that is, helps to educate Charlemagne, was an Irish monk. They went out to Ireland. They left Ireland and they went to the mainland, and they set up monasteries and everything. And so Ireland was a bright light. Unfortunately, in 660 and 680, Ireland suffers some big plagues. And this really, along with the Viking raids and the Viking invasions, puts a lid on Ireland. But Ireland is very, very important in the whole history of Europe. And as I say, it was a light amidst the darkness. And see, one of the things that I've shared is on the sacraments. One of the great gifts of the Irish was their instituting basically the Sacrament of Reconciliation as we pretty much know it today. See, I'm going to do it very briefly. It's something I said before. The way confession was done in the early church was this idea that if someone had suffered for the faith, they had suffered persecution, perhaps torture, the church saw them as basically people that had the charism of carrying out the mission of forgiveness in the church. And this was men and women. And so you would seek these people out. Somehow in their suffering for the faith, they had a charism to bring the forgiveness of God. Okay, this worked well in the first 300 years. But after persecution's end, what's going to happen? How does the church carry out this mission of bringing forgiveness to people? Okay, it became very rigid and difficult. What you had to do is you had to go to the community and confess your sin publicly. And the community would give you the penance. And many times it was sackcloth for 3 years. You would sit outside the church and beg forgiveness, and you'd be excluded from the community. It was very rigorous. Okay, basically the Irish monks said, okay, how does the church carry out its mission of bringing forgiveness to people? So they are the ones that established this idea of missioning priests. Priests that would carry out this mission of the church to bring forgiveness to people. It would be something very private and very confidential. Now, as I say, one of the things the Irish monks found very difficult is the fact was the idea you could only go to confession 4 times. Yes. In other words, boy, if you needed it the 5th time, you were a sucker, you were lost. And so, all right, now, I really see this as a pivotal moment. Now, one of the things I get from people is sometimes people have had a very rough time in confession, and I realize that. Many people are really afraid of it, and they have really been mistreated. Okay, that's a crime and a sin as far as I'm concerned, and I really mean that. It basically is losing this whole sense of the forgiveness of God. If I can editorialize it, in my theology, I'm convinced by the time anybody comes to me in confession, they're already forgiven. Let God be God. You've started the process, you're asking God for forgiveness. You're forgiven. All that we sometimes need is, we need to hear it. That's all of us. We need to hear it. Some months ago, I heard a confession of a priest, and I was talking to him and sharing with him. What the priest said, and this is something very important and telling, he said, you know, I can say that to others, but I can't say it to myself. I, as a priest, he was addressing, need you, Paul, to tell me. And that's the key thing. It's, God doesn't need me to forgive sins. It's that so often we need to hear it. You know, it's the same thing, you know, if a marriage is in difficulty and someone comes to me and says, he never or she never says, I love you. That's something that's part of relationship. We need to hear it. It has to be actualized. And that's the beauty of the Sacrament of Forgiveness. I have never been angry at anyone because I feel they're already forgiven by God. And I just want to celebrate that I can be the minister of this love. All right, end of my editorializing. But that was one of the gifts of the Irish monks. And I really think it's a tremendous gift. And as I say, if one of you has really been hurt, my heart goes out to you. Because to me, that's somebody has lost the vision of what the forgiveness of the church is. And they did a great job. They really kept alive everything. Okay. Well, all of this is also going on. There's a key man, just so that I know, a man called Mohammed. Mohammed, the founder of the Muslim faith, born in 570, dies in 632. He's Arabian. He's an Arab. Up to the time of his birth, the Arabians are a very scattered people. They're either Bedouins who live in the desert, camel drivers, sometimes have sheep. Then there's the people, the Arabs that lived at the oases, but there's no unity. Mohammed creates a special religion and brings the Arabs together. And what's monumental is, he dies in 632. What you have is, you have a very scattered, very weak people. He brings them together during his lifetime. And following his death in 632, they go out to conquer the whole Middle East. They establish an empire which goes from Iraq into Syria, Jordan, what we call present-day Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, all of North Africa, what we would call countries of Libya, Algeria, Morocco. And then they go and they conquer Spain. They do this in 1 century after the death of Mohammed. He dies in 632. There's a famous battle where Charles Martel has the title of the mayor of the palace. He's basically the prime minister of the king. His father was one of the Frankish nobles and kings, but in a real sense of the word, he's a bastard. He's illegitimate. So he can't inherit. But of all the sons of the king, he's the most able. So he manages to get power. He becomes mayor of the palace. He runs the estate of the king and the country of the king. He gets together an army in 732. And at the Pyrenees Mountains, he defeats the Moors. The Moors that were coming into Western Europe. So this great advance of the Muslims, the Arabs, and the Moors, had always been an unrelenting victory till 732, the Battle of Poitiers, where Charles Martel finally stops them at the French frontier. And Charles Martel is later on to be the grandfather of Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He stops the Moorish advances, and through him, he overthrows the Merovingians. The Merovingians were a noble family that ruled parts of France. And under him, he begins to expand his power. And eventually, he establishes a new family named after him, the Carolingians, which led to the great Charlemagne, the great king of the Franks, who finally establishes pretty much an empire. It goes from the Rhineland through a vast portion of France, and he brings for the first time some unity. Okay, what's happening to the church is the church has given up on expecting help from the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire is much more interested in its own affairs, and it no longer can protect Rome. It hasn't been able really to protect Rome for centuries. So what you have is Rome makes a decision to stop the artificial idea that the emperor in Byzantium is our protector. And, it's a fiction. It's a fiction, and it's been a fiction for centuries. But finally, the Pope says, our future is with the West. So the Pope crowned Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. Okay. This causes all kinds of problems with the Eastern Empire. As far as they are concerned, there is one emperor. And how can this uncivilized Babel in the West call themselves an emperor? And it really creates, it's part of the division that's going on between the East and the West churches. A division that's going to become total. But the emperor in the East is absolutely insulted that they would ever consider giving a title to this barbarian. What they consider this uncouth barbarian would have the title as a Holy Roman Emperor. And so they protest. They protest very much, and so does the church. And it just adds to the division between the East and the West. Now, the Byzantine Empire, as I say, they suffer the loss of part of their empire with the Arabs. But after, let's say, 700, it has rebounded. It rebounds tremendously. And the Byzantine Empire still remains very, very wealthy. Now, one of the things, for instance, you might have heard in the news about the Highest Sophia. The Highest Sophia was the great cathedral in Constantinople. And what the Highest Sophia means is the holy wisdom of God, which is Jesus. And that was a term in the East very commonly used. Jesus was the holy wisdom of God, the Word of God. And so this church was built about 550 in Constantinople. At the time it was built, it was the largest building in the known world. Now, so I have trouble. I have no idea if there were any buildings, let's say, in India or China, or even in the New World with the Aztecs or the Mayans, etc., or the Incas. But as far as the known world was concerned, the Highest Sophia was the largest building in the world. It was an architectural wonder with its dome. And it remains the great cathedral of the Byzantine Empire. It's built around 550, and it stands as a Christian cathedral for 9 centuries. Now, if you've been noticing in the news, the president of Turkey wants to restore it as a mosque. When Ataturk overthrew in about 1922, when he overthrew the old Ottoman emperors, the emperors in Constantinople, he overthrew them. And he declared a secular republic. And what he did is, Highest Sophia, he made a museum. So as a museum, the mosaics were uncovered. Remember, the Muslims, like the Jews, will not allow any art of anything living. Their art is always geometric. And it's part of this sense, you don't have anything that could be construed as idolatry. So he restored a lot of the art in the Highest Sophia. And so right now, since about 1923, it has been a museum. What's going to happen if they restore it as a mosque, I don't know. But it really, a lot of the people in the Eastern religions and in the Roman Catholic Church are appalled at what's happening and really have objected to what's happening. Now, the Byzantine Empire is a very strong empire. For instance, they managed to have for their fleet flamethrowers. They managed to create something where how they would defeat their enemy ships is they'd flamethrowers, great fire. And so if you got too close to a Byzantine ship, it would burn you. And Constantinople, I can't really draw it. Constantinople was an amazing city. It had walls all around it, and its inner harbor was cut off. Its inner harbor was cut off by chains, so that chains that could be low, if you were a friendly boat, chains were lowered to enter the inner harbor. If it was an enemy boat, they erected chains, and it couldn't sail in to the harbor, the Golden Horn. Constantinople was considered to be an impregnable city. And it stood only be conquered once before 1453. And that was by one of the Crusades. One of the Crusades attacked Constantinople and actually through treachery conquered it. Okay, Constantinople was doing very, very well. However, like in anything, it was growing old. One of the great areas of protection for the whole Byzantine Empire was at the end of the Anatolian plain, it was the mountain range. The mountain range was ringed by forts that kept the Arabs out. And so pretty much the Anatolian plain, which is very flat, was protected, and the empire flourished. In the year 1095, the Battle of Manzikert, the Arabs inflict a major defeat on the Greeks, on the Byzantines. They break through the chain of fortresses on the Ving, and it's going to take years, but it's the beginning of the spell of the ending of the Byzantine Empire. Because now the Arabs can raid that whole plain of the Anatolian plain where the people of Byzantium live. And it begins to really sap the strength of the Byzantine Empire. Now, what's very important about this is this leads to the Crusades. The Pope in Rome is very well aware of what this threat to Byzantium is. And what's very interesting in the Crusades is the Pope wants to help the Byzantine Empire. He figures if he can help the Byzantine Empire restore this line of fortresses and allow the Byzantine Empire to exist, then there will be the reunion of the churches. And so when you read the works of Urban, who calls the Crusades, primarily he wants to aid the Byzantine Empire. Okay, now, if I can do a little editorializing, there's always a difference between the real reason for a war and the selling of the war. And, excuse me my cynicism, but, you have to realize that, for instance, the Pope realizes that try to sell this war to the people in the West to help the Byzantine Empire. All he'll get is a yawn. Who wants to help them? So the Pope decides, what I'm going to do is, I will tie it in with bringing Christian rule to the Holy Land. That's a wonderful way to get people interested. Don't you want to go to Israel and liberate this land where Jesus lived? And so this is what so when he preaches the Crusades, what he talks about is relieving the Holy Land, bringing this land, which is now under Arab rule, that once again, Jerusalem can be a Christian city, that people can go there as pilgrimage to this country of Jesus Christ. So when he preaches it in southern France, that's what he talks about. Go out, restore Jesus' land to its rightful owners, the Christians. All right. This is the beginning of the Crusades, and he gets people. Unfortunately, what's happening is the Pope really is very high-minded in what he wants with the Crusades. Unfortunately, the people leading the Crusades have their own interests. What they are hoping to carve out is their own little kingdoms in the East. They're very interested in padding their own wealth. And so in the East, the Byzantines, the history of the Crusades is a very sad moment, because the Crusades, if anything, actually further weaken the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines are highly organized. For instance, for each of their army, they have quartermaster corps, to provide food, supplies for the army. As far as the people from the West are concerned, you live off the land. And so by pillage or stealing or robbing, you get the supplies that you need. So what happens? When the armies reach the East, the Byzantines, they treat them as the enemy. They don't speak the same language, and they pillage and raid the Byzantine Empire. And exactly what the Pope does not want happens is the split is just furtherly created. In fact, in the Fourth Crusade, I'm hitting them very quickly. In the Fourth Crusade, you have crusaders come to Venice. They have no money, and they have no way to reach the Holy Land. Venice sees Constantinople as its rival, in trade. So what does Venice do? This wonderful Christian city of Venice. They say, okay, we'll help you if you will attack Constantinople. So what does the Fourth Crusade do? Is basically they announce that they're coming to save the Holy Land. They go in, they conquer Constantinople, and they set up a Western emperor. They kill the emperor that is there, his children flee, and they take over Constantinople for about 60 years. The Pope condemns it, but unfortunately the next Pope says, well, we have unity. And so rather than continue the condemnation, he allows it. But for the people of the Byzantine Empire, it's a moment they will never, ever forgive, is the treachery of Venice in using a crusade to actually conquer them. The Crusades managed to get some kingdoms in the Middle East, and you have some Christian kingdoms there for about 60 or 70 years. But finally, they're going to be actually overwhelmed by the Arabs, and these Christian kingdoms in the East are wiped out. And once again, Israel will be in the hands of the Eastern people, and especially now by the Turks. A word about the Arabs. The Arabs were actually allowed a tremendous intellectual development. The work that they allowed, for instance, in art, philosophy, science, was phenomenal. Under the Arabs, Baghdad had a great university that was the rival of any university in the world. If you ever go to Spain, where the Moors were, they were a very tolerant people. They allowed Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live side by side. The artwork, if you've ever been to the Alhambra in Spain, and the architecture that they inspired. Briefly, what happens is the Arabs sent out missionaries who convert the Turks and make them Muslims. What happened is the Turks then invade and capture the Arabs. And they tend to institute a very conservative style of Muslims. If the Arabs are really open to other things, which they were, the Turks are not. And so the Turks bring a whole new conservative idea to the Muslim church. And they really are their philosophy and theology really begins to affect the entire church. And remember, the Turks are going to rule the Arabs for centuries. All you have to do is remember Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia brings the Arabs together against the Turks and finally wrestles the Turks out of Arabia, out of Jordan, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. What they think is they're going to be able to reestablish the old caliphate, the old Arab caliphate. Unfortunately, they don't realize is what Britain and France want. Britain and France have totally different ideas. They want to extend their empire. And so that's why, for instance, that you have a British mandate over Iraq, over France has Lebanon and Syria. Palestine, which is Jordan and Israel, is English. But the Turks run the Middle East from now on until you have the idea of Lawrence of Arabia in the First World War. Okay, that's my talk for today. We've covered a great deal. Any questions? Put up your hand and you know, I'm giving a wide scope. I've covered 600 years. And so a lot of things are left out, but I guess, yes.
If you want to talk, raise your hand or
Yes.
something so we know who it is.
Jim O'Hare.
You mentioned Irish monks. Was there, did they sort of develop independently of Benedict, or was that part of the stream that was introduced by Patrick?
They were part of the monastic system. Patrick, but he's contemporaneous also with Benedict. But Patrick learns about the monastic system that's coming in Italy, and he establishes it. And he establishes it in Ireland. And so we talk about Benedict as the father of Western monasticism, but not every monastery is going to fall. There were other people who had the same idea, and among them was Patrick. Does that answer your question?
Sure. So it was, I guess, as he grew up besides his time of slavery, he picked up Benedictine concepts and.
Yes.
Okay.
Mary.
I'm kind of, in a way, astounded but interested to see how the church and government, the polity of that intertwining process, it seems to me, of church and governance over people is so enmeshed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, many times it was the fact that a bishop realized
He knows a lot. I don't know, but that's why I turned this.
it was, part of it was a bishop realized he was the only authority. Roman authority had simply collapsed. And so what you had was a real unity of church and state in the West. And, it's one of those things that sometimes, once it begins, people don't know how to end it. Does that answer your question? And that's the mistake very often. For instance, many historians think that it was a real blessing in the church when Italy seized the papal lands in 1871. The Pope, in 1871, the papal states were all seized. And the Pope, the Quirinal Palace, which is the residence of the kings and the presidents of Italy, was the residence of the Pope. The Pope flees to the Vatican City and is so-called prisoner of the Vatican City. And that happens in 1871. 1929, you have the Lateran Treaty, which basically creates the Vatican City state, that 400-acre enclave. And probably one of the greatest blessings is when the Pope no longer had land. In some ways, the Pope has become far more influential and stronger. He doesn't have an army or things like that. Stalin sarcastically said, how many divisions does the Pope have? He doesn't. But the moral authority of the Pope, I find, is much greater. So part of it probably was necessary at times in the disorder of the times. But it's when you realize it's no longer needed and you give it up. Does that answer your question? I can't hear you.
Yes.
I said thank you. Yes, it does.
Okay, I just couldn't hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Robert and Karen, do you have your hands up?
Yes, Father. So it's truly only within like 100 years ago that the separation between the state and church has continued.
Well, what I'm saying is the Pope in Italy till 1871, he was, a third of Italy was under him. He was the Pope, but he also was the king of 1/3 of Italy.
Wow.
And, you know, these were the papal states. And, you know, he just didn't recognize the fact that Italy was coming together. So all of Italy was united against the Turin family. And they had declared themselves the king of Italy. But it excluded the papal states. And what happened is the French kept an army there to protect the Pope. The French kept an army. Unfortunately, with trouble simmering with Prussia, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871, France has to move its troops out. Without the French troops to protect the Pope, Italy moves in. And to me, it probably is a blessing in disguise. No longer was the Pope tied up with lands. And when you see the history, the Pope also was a military, would lead armies. What is the movie about Michelangelo? You know, it opens up with the Pope on horseback leading some soldiers into a city. So when he gets to the cathedral, you know, he suddenly takes off his armament and puts on his papal robes. The Pope had a whole very different function. And as I say, once we got outside of trying to run lands and conquer lands, we were much better off.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say it sounds like that practice or that history might explain some of the anti-Catholicism that was so apparent in our own American history.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, for instance, France, which is a Catholic country, one of the difficulties was the bishops remained very much against the Republic. They were very pro-monarchy. And this led to all kinds of problems because of their mistakes. You know, France, the anti-clerical laws of 1905 in France, which forced many religious communities out of France. France is a Catholic country. And you have laws against priests and religious. For instance, for the Jesuits, we were kicked out of France after 1905. Our headquarters were in the island of Jersey. And what you have is a very interesting history that a lot of people don't realize. When World War II started, clergy did not have an exemption from the military. And so many priests and seminarians got draft notices from the French. Most of the provincials pleaded with the seminarians to respond, to go back, because they said, this is going to be the only way we're going to get back into France. And so something like 4,000 priests and seminarians responded. And what happened during the war, the number of medals and heroism that they did was very important. because their gallantry and everything was wonderful. In fact, what happens is, after the war, Clemenceau orders all the priests back out of France. You know, many of them have died, have been wounded and everything. And he orders them, get out of France again. And there's a very moving thing. Many of these priests with their medals, and they were on crutches and wheelchairs, they protested outside of the presidential palace. Clemenceau ordered French troops to fire on them. The French army mutinies and refuses to fire on them. And this was the moment finally where Clemenceau had to back down and the priests stayed. So often it was our involvement where we crossed the line with church and state that we paid a price. And so, you know, and if I could share one little thing is, Pius XI sees the church partially responsible for Mussolini, because under Pius IX and then Leo XIII and then Pius X, it had been the fact that if you participated in the Kingdom of Italy, you voted, you participated, you were excommunicated. So a lot of very fervent Catholics stayed out of the government. They refused to take part in the state. And Benedict and then Pius XI really believed this led to Mussolini in 1922. Catholics had simply failed to do their job. So he wants to settle the situation. He wants desperately to normalize it. And so they sign the Lateran Treaty. But one of the fascinating things, and I love this because if you think there's no politics in the church, forget it, is Mussolini is being, you know, the Depression is going on in Italy. So he's being moved and pressured to provide public housing. There's an area around Rome he wants to build. Fortunately, it's owned by the Dominicans. It's a big area owned by the Dominicans. And he doesn't dare confiscate it. I mean, he has the power to confiscate it, but he doesn't want to mess up the negotiations for the Lateran Treaty. So the Dominicans hear about this. So they approach Mussolini and said, we'll be happy to sell the land to you if you do one thing, if you have Albert the Great canonized. So Mussolini, so that's right in the Lateran Treaty. So Mussolini insisted that the Pope canonize Albert the Great. So it's right in the treaty, Albert the Great, there are no miracles, nothing. So in 1932, 3 years later, the Pope canonizes it. You know, he was a great man. You know, he was a great man and probably deserved it. But that's a little bit of the politics that played out in the church. Any other questions? Yes, Jim.
Isn't this, in this period, isn't that when the celibate discipline came into the Western Church? And do you have time to comment?
Wait a second. We just been talking about Mussolini, the 1900s. What?
Yeah, I'm backtracking into the period of your lecture.
Okay. The idea of celibacy begins to take over more and more 800s, 900s, yes. And now part of it was again, see, again, who owns the church? If you're a pastor, do you own the church? And the question is, and this was happening, I'm pastor of this little church. I'm married. So when I die in my will, I leave it to my wife. I mean, this was a real problem. See, you know, you don't have the corporate law, all the law that we have today. And so that was one of the reasons, and part of the reason why the church began to emphasize celibacy, yes. Because celibacy was never demanded for priests in the East. They could marry. However, all the bishops came from the monks. If you were married, you could not be a bishop unless your wife had died. But pretty much the bishops always came from the monks. But the clergy could be married if they were married before their ordination. Any other questions? Evelina?
Hold on. Hold on, Evelina.
Okay, Evelina.
Okay, did you ever read, it's an Irishman, Peter Tremaine. He's an historian, and he writes about the clergy in Ireland. Like they had like separate monasteries for married couples, and then for single ones and things like that. Peter Tremaine.
Yes.
So that's, you know, and then also this way, I can see why they wouldn't want them to be married, because then they left the property to the family instead of the church.
Yes.
That was one reason.
Yes.
I thought that was one of the and Peter Tremaine has a series about a nun, which is interesting. In the 1600s, six something in all happening in Ireland, which I like.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's it.
Yes. Joan.
Hold on. Wait. Hold on, Joan.
Thank you. At that particular time, when that decision was
What time can you, at what that particular time, what are you talking about?
when the law came about that priests could not marry,
Yes.
what happened during that time with priests who were married?
Well, I mean, in other words, it was introduced gradually. They recognized some priests were validly married.
Mhm.
And so it was, in the future, you could not do it.
Okay. And there must have been some priests that wanted to be married. Why did they go along with this just because of the money issue? Why not have priests that choose celibacy and priests that don't? Who knows, huh?
Too
Who
much-
knows? I have no idea. You know, I have no idea.
Mhm.
You know, just, what I'm convinced is that, you know, today, a lot of diocesan priests, probably, some of them would probably have been married. You know, you're not going to find the religious getting married. But then there might be some religious who would not have joined the Jesuits or the other religious communities if they could be married. Okay. All right. It's 11:15. Thank you.
Before we go, we want to make sure that you all know that these lectures are being posted on the parish YouTube channel. So I've sent out instructions on how to get to it. But basically, you go to YouTube, search for St. Ignatius Parish, and then when you get to that, you'll see owls. You'll see a box that says owls. And then you click on playlist, and then you see each week there. And I'll send it on an email to you, but Some of you haven't been here the whole time, so you might want to go back and listen, or friends might want to listen. The very first one, July 3rd, it's only audio. There's no pictures. So that's because I didn't know how. I did it, but anyway, there we go. Anything about that you need to know? Okay, and when it's recorded with Paul's face big.
You like that?
So it switches back and forth to some pictures of all of us, but basically it's the speaker. So we're learning slowly. And Debbie, do you have anything to add to that?
No, thank you, Barbara. I've just placed in the chat box both of the links, one to the OWLS playlist of our lecture series,
Okay.
which is where this video will be added soonest, and then one just to the YouTube channel generally, where we get, live mass on Sunday morning and all of the other video offerings, concerts, and so forth. So those two links are in your chat box. So that's the little chat button next to share screen.
Yeah, at the bottom of your Zoom screen,
Yeah.
if you put your cursor down there, you'll see a chat box.
Yeah.
Chat. And if you click on it or go to that, you'll see what Debbie is just talking about. And you can always call me or email Debbie if you're having trouble with that. I've become an expert.
Thanks
We have
for
one more
doing it.
comment. One more comment.
Yes?
Father, thank you. This is brilliant and wonderful and exciting, and I can hardly wait till next time.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Father.
Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Quite.
Love you.
Love you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.